I'm really very excited about our next panel. It's about the need for communicating about food and agriculture to a wide and diverse audience. Although we've talked a lot about the need for more youth in farming and the need for more farmers in general, we also need more storytellers and communicators who can tell the story of food, people who can put a face to the issues that we're talking about today and engage eaters, businesses, policymakers, and producers. I'm really thrilled to introduce Frank Sesno, who, in addition to being one of my many heroes here today, is part of the GW family as the director of George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs. He has more than 30 years of experience reporting from around the world and hosted his own talk show on CNN. He also created George Washington's Planet Forward, bringing students and experts together to examine innovations in sustainability and global food security. I also get to introduce one of my favorite reporters today who will be moderating this panel. Allison Aubrey is an award-winning journalist with National Public Radio and writes for The Salt, NPR's award-winning food blog. Her stories can be heard on Morning Edition and All Things Considered. She's also the host of NPR's video series, Tiny Desk Kitchen. So please join me in welcoming our Frank to the stage, as well as our panelists who are coming from all over to join us today. Thank you.
Don't fall. Well, hello, everybody. How was lunch? Good. We're glad. We hope you all had a seat. It is a great pleasure and privilege to be here. Thanks to Danielle, thanks to Kathleen Merrigan, Diane Knapp, and to all of you for coming and gathering. As Danielle said, as the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs, as the originator of Planet Forward, having this conversation here and being a part of it is actually a great thrill. And I'm so looking forward, Allison and panel, to the conversations that you're going to have. So food is a story. And that's what we do here. We tell stories. We teach our students how to tell stories. We think about how we can use the media more effectively and creatively to tell stories, how we can engage an audience, which is more shattered, disaggregated is the term we use, than ever because of all these media. It sort of works at cross purposes with itself sometimes. How we tell these stories. Food is a story. It is an economic story. It is a nutrition story. It is an equity and social justice story. It is an aesthetic story. It is a social story. It is a moral story. How do we rationalize wasting a third of our food when we have nearly 1 billion people confronting food insecurity on this planet? So how do we tell the story better, more effectively? How can you tell the story? Because guess what? You're all storytellers. We're all storytellers. We met Ben Simon earlier today, a remarkable young man, a college student. He saw something bothered him. He went and jumped into action, and he created his remarkable recovery food network to deal with food waste. That's a story. He's a story. We met a farmer at one of our Planet Forward salons by the name of Tom Lithicum. If any of you have driven through Maryland and seen the signs, you've seen signs for Lithicum, Maryland. That's his family. Generations ago, and he's been a farmer for generations as well. And he told his own personal story. We were having a conversation about climate and farming, and we heard from meteorologists and climatologists and people with all sorts of data. And then Tom said, you know what? I'm a farmer. And when I was younger, we would get these long rains in the spring that were sort of misty and they would saturate the earth. And now we get more downpours and the runoff has changed and I've had to build berms and put in new drainage systems. And suddenly he was telling a story. And people, especially our students in the room, got it. It wasn't some vague policy conversation, as important as the vague and specific policy conversations are. It was about a person doing a real thing to continue to keep his farm in business as a result of changes he has experienced. He brought it to life. A few years ago when I was doing a documentary for CNN, I went down to Brazil and I spent the day, 2 days actually, with an amazing man who was growing sugarcane for sugarcane ethanol in Brazil. And we went through his whole spread, and we saw how sugarcane is planted only once every 5 years as opposed to corn, and corn ethanol, which has to be planted every year. Well, that saves the soil because you're not planting it so much. And then when it's cut and burned, they have the bagasse, which is the burnt remains, which goes back down and as a nutrient for the soil. And because sugarcane is so dense and thick and green and rich, it's a carbon sink, and they were selling carbon credits to a Swedish company. And he went on, and it was an unbelievable story that I then finished by driving a rented Chevrolet that was running on his sugarcane ethanol down the road saying, why can't I drive a car like this in the United States of America? It was the best stand-up I've ever done, and I was sitting down behind the wheel of a car. There's a guy by the name of Gary Beck. I met Gary Beck at another gathering. He's a farm manager at Hillside Ranch in Blaine County, Idaho, and he grows barley. What do we use barley for? Beer. Okay, there's a story. I know I got young people now. Well, what Gary's been encountering is that in the last 10 years, his aquifer has dropped 50 feet. And he was working with Miller Coors to figure out what was happening and how they could grow that barley with less water, because both Gary and Miller Coors needs the water. He was a story. Mary Jenga. Mary Jenga is a postdoctoral fellow in bioenergy. She is Kenyan. She works with women in the most intense, dense slum in Nairobi, Kibera, to make biomass fuel briquettes to replace wood in indoor cook stoves. Some of our students discovered Mary when they went for Planet Forward to shoot a story. And they brought her back, recorded, and edited it into an amazing story. And we so fell in love with the story that we invited Mary to come here. And Mary presented. But then Mary talked to a group of students, and she explained how she'd gotten into this. That as a young girl, it was her job with her family every day to go get wood for the cook stove. And she would walk to the woods. And it was an hour away. And as she got older, the woods got farther and farther away because they were being cut down. That by the time she was a young woman, it was a full-day trek. And that galvanized her to do something about it and to start making and working with women to make these biomass fuel briquettes. Her story so galvanized the students who were listening to it that they volunteered to do a Kickstarter campaign and to work with her. It made it real, it made it human. There's Kathleen Merrigan, whom my students profiled for an assignment. And she talked to them about organics and how she wrote the law and all the rest. But then what brought the story to life was Kathleen started talking about how she shopped for her family and how you shop from the outside in a grocery store and how you use a farmer's market. All these are examples of stories. We tell our students that the definition of a really great story is pretty simple. Shakespeare knew it. We've known it since the beginning of time. Compelling characters seeking to overcome obstacles to achieve a worthy outcome. Compelling characters overcoming obstacles to achieve a worthy outcome. That's what all of you do. It's what every farmer does every year. It's what people in poverty do to just try to survive. These are stories. So if we are to be more effective at telling the food story, stories, plural, right? Nutritional, agricultural, environmental, you name it. We need to be better storytellers. And we need to be storytellers who do not just focus on the negative or the doom and the gloom, because there's plenty of that, but also on the invention and the innovation and the intellect and the curiosity and the imagination that we bring to this. Because as we've talked to every one of these farmers, to every one of these NGOs, to everyone, not everyone, but most everyone in the private sector, we hear compelling characters trying to overcome obstacles to achieve a worthy outcome. And told right, that's riveting. I said each of us, each of you is a storyteller. How many of you have a Twitter account? Facebook? How many of you post on Facebook? Okay, a lot of hands up. We should all have our hands up. Me too. We can tell stories through video, through text, through tweets. We tell stories with our friends. We tell stories at work to be more effective. This is the fundamental of communication, I think. There's a very interesting game I play with my students to try to make it real, and I'll play it with you here very quickly. I call it the grandma game, and those of you who've hung around with me have heard me tell this before, so please excuse me. So let's start with a contest. Who thinks they have the oldest grandma in the room? Who's got an old grandma alive? How old is your grandma? 95. That's pretty good. Anybody older? Okay, so 95. So here's the game. You got great DNA. Are you a student? Recent student. Oh, sure. So you've got great DNA in your family. If you live to 95, what year is that? Take your birth year, add 100, subtract 5. I'm helping you here. You can do this. I know you can do this. What year were you born? 1969. So you would live to, that would be 2065. 2065. I play it with my students. Most of them were born in 1995. 1990, it's scary. That means they could be seeing 2085. Their kids, 2110, 2120, who knows? I say to them, for you, 2050, 9 billion people on the planet is tomorrow. How we feed them, how we clothe them, how we water them. That's our challenge. That's your story. You're a compelling character. Go overcome the obstacles. Thank you.
So as Danny said, I'm Allison Aubrey of NPR News. We've got a great panel for you here today. Everyone has compelling characters who've overcome obstacles. We will hear all about them. Just a short note on the appeal of putting food at the center of your life's work. I think that once you're using food as a lens, you have easy access to all of the important issues of the day. So if you know that your audience loves donuts, well, maybe they'll be interested in the idea of deforestation due to palm oil. If you connect it back to donuts, if you know your audience loves tomatoes, well, perhaps they might be interested in the plight of workers who pick them. So telling the story of food, from where I sit, there's a little bit of a formula. You find the thing, the way that you're going to connect with people, and then they're much more interested in the broader issues, be it climate change, income inequality. So simply put, in my work as a journalist covering food, we sort of hit it from all angles. Certainly food is part celebration, food is part nutrition science, we do a lot of that, but increasingly we simply see food as the lens into all of the important issues of the day. So let me introduce our panelists, Roger Thurow, right here. He is an author and journalist. His book, The Last Hunger Season, A Year in an African Farm Community on the Brink of Change, is full of both, I started reading it a couple of days ago, I'd say it's full of both outrage and inspiration, painting the picture of small farmers in Western Kenya. He was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal for 3 decades, 20 of those years as a foreign correspondent based in Europe and Africa. After leaving the Journal, he joined the Chicago Council on Global Affairs as Senior Fellow for Global Agriculture and Food Policy. Next to him, Sam Fromartz is a veteran journalist who focuses on the intersection of food, agriculture, and the environment. He is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Food and Environment Reporting Network, known as FERN. He's also the author of In Search of the Perfect Loaf, a home baker's odyssey. And the man really can bake some bread. I know that firsthand. He taught my colleague Dan Charles how to make a stellar loaf of bread. Next we have Vicki Robin. Vicki is the co-author of a perennial bestseller called Your Money or Your Life, and the author of a new book, Blessing the Hands That Feed Us, Lessons from a 10-Mile Diet. She's been called the prophet of consumption downsizers by the New York Times. She designed and launched something called the 10-Day Local Food Challenge for eaters who wanted to kickstart their shift to local eating. Next to Vicki, we have Erik Hoffner, who is a photographer and contributing writer for Grist, EcoWatch, and World Arc. When he is not on assignment, his day job is outreach coordinator at the award-winning literary journal of the environment, Orion. He is also an exhibiting member of the Vermont Center for Photography. Next to Erik, we have Diana Donlon of the Center for Food Safety. She's the director of the CFS's Cool Foods campaign, a solutions-oriented program that aims to empower the public to make connections between food and climate. She served in the Peace Corps in Morocco. She speaks French and Spanish. She lives in Marin County with her husband, her teenage sons, her Maine Coon cat, and her 3 chickens. And we have at the very end down there Sarah Buzogany. Sarah is the food access planner for the Baltimore Food Policy Initiative, a city that now has, in essence, a food czar. Sarah has previously worked on sustainable ag policy, both at the national and the state level, and she has a master's in food policy and applied nutrition from Tufts University and holds a degree in sustainable ag from the University of Kentucky. So thanks to all of you for joining us. And I thought I'd start with you, Roger. In your book, one of the things that was very compelling to me from the start is that the first person you meet in this village in Western Africa, you realize you have a connection with this man. You realize that you were both born in 1956. Take the story from there. Talk about how making these connections with people helps open up the world of storytelling.
Yeah, thank you very much, Allison. Frank, great introduction. Food is a marvelous, compelling, vitally, extremely important story, and getting more important as we go along. And when you first introduced me, you mentioned the kind of this 1-2 punch of outrage and inspire, which is kind of my journalistic mantra and what I like to deploy in my writing. I guess if you looked in on me on my times of writer's block, which are frequent, it wouldn't be particularly pretty what you would see, but I'd be kind of outrage and inspire, and so I feel I was channeling or feeling the outrage and energy of Ben Simon when he was speaking earlier. And I think that can be really, really effective. Outrage that we brought hunger with us into the 21st century, at a time when we're producing more food than ever before, but inspire that there's so many people on the front lines of building a better food system. And many of you are in this room or watching on the live stream. And I think what really makes that really impactful, the outrage and inspire, is then when one focuses, as Frank was talking about, on the characters and the people and the individuals. And they provide the compelling stories and the compelling narratives. And that's what I then tried to do in the last hunger season. And in that book, I follow 4 farmers through the course of a year. There are 4 farmers in Western Kenya, and follow them through the course of the year as they descend into this profound period of deprivation in the hunger season. And the outrage and inspire that I was working on that was the outrage that I think is the cruelest irony in the world, and particularly the cruelest irony of Africa, is that Africa's hungriest people are her smallholder farmers. And the absurdity and obscenity and stupidity of that oxymoron, hungry farmers. It's kind of the outrage, but the inspiration of what these farmers were doing themselves, these 4 farmers and this social enterprise organization that they were working with, the 1 Acre Fund, to kind of come out of that and conquer their own hunger seasons. Those 4 farmers, and the one that Allison was mentioning, that I had met, one is a man named Francis Mamati. Kind of of the 4 farmers, 3 are women, and one then, Francis, the man, which kind of reflects the demographics of who was doing the smallholder farming in Africa, as we heard earlier, mainly women. And when I met Francis, it turns out, I just asked him kind of the easy initial information. Well, how old are you? He said when he was born, 1957. Don't add another year to me. It's okay. She's born in 1957. I said, Francis, that's when I was born. So I figured, well, when were you born? Maybe some weird cosmic thing that we're kind of share the same birthday. And he said, I think I was born in May or June. I said, May or June? I mean, he's got 12 months to pick from. Why May or June? He says, my mom, she gave me a second name, a third name, Francis Mamati, a middle name, Wanjala. Wanjala is their word for hunger. There, they frequently name their children after the time of the growing season when they were born. The depth of this hunger season, of this period of profound deprivation in Western Kenya, is usually May or June. So he figures, I must have been born during that time. So I said, Francis, you're one of the farmers that I need to follow because your very name is what I'm trying to capture, this Wanjala, this hunger season. And then his efforts to basically turn that name to become Mr. Wakeza, which is the harvest and the great harvest. So just in that embodiment of that one character then became kind of this outrage and this inspiration all at one time.
Excellent. So Sam, as we talked in the introduction, you wear a lot of hats. At Fern, you're trying to get freelancers to write great stories connecting perhaps personal issues to environment, trying to bring environmental and ag policy issues to life. In your own book, The Home Baker's Odyssey, it seems to me that you're teaching people to bake bread, but you're using it as a platform, a way to get them engaged in, for instance, biodiversity issues. Talk a little bit of how you've sort of woven surreptitiously, perhaps, some of these headier issues into the art of baking bread.
Yeah, well, I mean, the remarks that my colleagues made, and that you made in the opening, really kind of, set the frame. I mean, our organization, the Food and Agriculture, the Food and Environment Reporting Network, we focus on food, agriculture, and environmental health, and that covers a huge swath of topics. But basically, we have a really simple job, which is to find stories and put them out in the world. And we see that really as a public good because we're increasing the knowledge and potentially leading to some outrage and action, on the part of our readers or viewers or listeners, because we produce stories for all different kinds of mediums. But it's really in the packaging of the story. I'm usually interested in biodiversity issues. The FAO yesterday came out with a report on biodiversity and wild species, and I'm sure nobody saw it. And yet, in this book that I wrote about, that focuses on bakers, grains, and bread, I used bread as a way to discuss biodiversity through taste, through the cultivars we've lost, that kind of thing. And my connection suddenly was to all these home bakers, from which I'm now getting email from, a mother in Duluth, who's talking to me about baking bread, or someone who recounts their grandmother in Italy who had her own sourdough starter, and in the book I talk about the diversity in starters. So it's how do you get into an issue? How do you engage people? One of the topics that we've hit on very strongly and consistently, because we think it's a huge public health issue, is the issue of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and which arise which are linked to large-scale industrial farming operations, where these bacteria are bred, and they can cause drug-resistant infections. And
in one story, you linked this to women's health, urinary tract infections.
So if you do want to do a story on drug-resistant bacteria, you might get some readers. Maybe people in this audience would be interested. But in this story, the reporter Maren McKenna pitched me on the phone, and she said, I've seen a number of studies that have linked drug-resistant urinary tract infections to the same bacteria, drug-resistant bacteria, that's found in supermarket chicken. In other words, the researchers had genetically fingerprinted the bacteria in both the infections as well as the chicken. And I immediately thought, that is a great story. And aside from, obviously, the implications of this, It ties a health issue that's of concern to, as many as 8 million women a year suffer from these infections, to a common food that everybody eats and potentially could be misused if you don't treat it properly in your kitchen, and to an agriculture issue. And here was a story that tied, these three areas of our focus kind of together. And so I immediately was taken by the story. I pitched the story on the phone actually to ABC News, and they were taken by it too. So the point is, I wasn't pitching a story on antibiotic-resistant bacteria. I was really pitching a health story, and a health story that viewers might have even encountered. So it was a natural. It was just a natural topic, and really that's the way we try and think about our stories as. What are the interests? What are the various audiences that could be touched by this story and would be interested in it? Is it just farmers? Is it people interested in food? Is it people interested in health? Is it people interested in global poverty issues? Or is there a story that somehow ties all of these issues together? And we don't always hit those kind of home runs, but that's really the way we try and think of stories, and the way we try and really package these issues for audiences so that they resonate. And frankly, that's what I did in my book too. I didn't write a book about biodiversity. I wrote a book about bread, but everybody who read the book learned about biodiversity. So. And
Excellent.
the importance of it.
And Vicki, Robin, to me, it seems that the art you practice in your writing, at least in your two books, is sort of story-based learning. You are the compelling character, looking to overcome the obstacle. In your new book, you're looking to overcome the obstacle of eating locally when you happen to live on an island. Is that right?
Right. So, yeah, the book is Blessing the Hands That Feed Us. And it started really as a double dare from a farmer friend of mine who was watching a takeoff on Morgan Spurlock's Super Size Me. And her husband said, we should do Super Veggie Me. 30 days eating vegetables from your garden. And neither one of them was willing to do it themselves. So they went around looking for somebody, and for me, I say that sustainability is an extreme sport. It's something that you're supposed to live, not just something to talk about. So that sounded, and also I'm a lifelong dieter, and as the prophet of consumption downsizers, there was one form of consumption that was off the table, of course, because I'm a sport eater. It's like I'm happy I eat, I'm sad I eat. It's like I'm bored I eat. And when I'd like to eat now. No. So no, I actually don't want to. Anyway, so she double dared me. So we made a pact, that she would feed me for a month from what she grew in her garden, and that I said we'll blog for food. So I would blog every day and document. And really, I'm saying it in a light way, but for me, actually, it is a sustainability issue. I heard somebody speak, and they were talking about the island. And we're serviced by a bridge to the south, and a bridge to the north, and a ferry to the south. And it's a semi-rural island. And
in a northern climate, we should say. We're not talking about a tropical island. We're talking Washington.
Not a tropical island, but actually, I asked her, how long could we feed ourselves in Whidbey Island, from Whidbey Island? And she said, probably 2 weeks in August. And so that was what got my attention. What do we do the rest of the year? 95% of our food comes in on trucks on a semi-rural island that looks like it's farming. So I wanted to test the resilience of my food system, so I took on this challenge. And the story is really, the little innocent person overcoming big obstacles. There's allies, there are enemies, and most of the enemies were internal. Like, I actually gave myself 4 exotics because I wasn't willing to live without some of them, like caffeine. So it's the story of my effort to live a value that is espoused by many people. It's the hip, cool thing, local food, but how do you live it? And once I entered through the gateway of local food, and they say know your farmer, but for me it wasn't just like go to the farmer's market and have a pleasant smile. It was like, what are the issues that are driving the lives of these people? And we heard about that today, about off-farm income, and they can't really make it. And then I learned about the driving up of land prices. So for me, that personal experiment, in a way I've done this before. I did it with money, Your Money or Your Life, and I did it with dialogue. You know, how can we transform our society to a society of dialogue? Well, I invented a game. It's sort of like gamification of change. You know, you develop something that isn't prescriptive, it isn't telling people what to do, but it's giving people a process to actually experience for themselves. So Blessing the Hands That Feed Us came out of that diet. Out of that came people saying, how do I do this? And I was like, well, just figure it out for yourself, you know, go find a farmer. So, but I actually, out of that, I created yet one more game. And it's called the 10-Day Local Food Challenge. And for 10 days in October, you eat food from 100 miles radius of your home, giving yourself 10 exotics. How easy is that? Foods from afar you can't live without. And you take an opening survey to say who you are as an eater, and then a closing survey to say what you learned. And what I watched people do is they entered into that game, is they went through the transformation I went through. My interest with this game, I'm calling it a game because it's really, yeah, there's a bunch of rules. There are very few rules that generate a lot of experience. You enter into the story rather than reading the story. So I'm inviting all of you to do the challenge this year. But what I see is that if people have this experience for themselves, they are going to be like me, passionate food system change makers. They are going to find the places where they can enter into the story of the transformation of our food systems. And for me, my passion is restoring the vitality and productivity and prosperity and abundance of our regional food systems. That's where I really think that we need to make a concerted effort to take ourselves even from 5% to 10%. And my crazy goal, because I like numbers that match, is 50% of our food from within 500 miles by 2050. Can we restore our regional food systems to feed the people? And it sounds like outrageous, but it's sort of common sense as well. So that's the story.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. So, Erik, your work as a photographer, I know you're a man of words and photos, is intriguing to me. The other day, there was this beautiful sunset outside the NPR building, and you know, in a building filled with people who speak for a living, everybody lined up at the window and had nothing to say about this beautiful sunset. We all just sort of stared at it in awe. And so a beautiful image is evocative. We can feel it move our soul. But how do you tell a story? How is it that a picture paints 1,000 words?
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. That's great. It's great to hear that. Beautiful moments like that when you're speechless. It's the same sort of thing that I go for with photography. And when I do assignments, a lot of times when I work up a new assignment, my first feeling is how does the imagery work into this? You know, what kind of subjects am I going to need to show in order to basically build the words around? I think maybe I come at stories backwards in a lot of ways, but for me, the visuals are a really big part of telling the story, and whether I go on to use them to illustrate the story or mount an exhibit or something like that, through the images you can continue to tell those stories, and it reaches people that won't sit and read a blog post, you know. But the point is changing people, and what I've always found is that changing people means telling stories, sharing your story. And I think I learned that most clearly when I was teaching 6th graders. You know, tell a story and you'll change everything in the classroom, at least for that, you know, 5-10 minutes. And it resets everyone. Everyone can listen to you now because you're telling your story or someone else's story. So, you know, how that, I try to bring that into all the stories I do. I start with the personal. I bring in the community, and then we try to work in the macro. And I think that's sort of like how a lot of the good stories work is, you know, how is, say, the food system affecting me? And then how is it affecting you and me? In our, you know, what's the food system mean to our community? And then you dial it out, and you talk about, you know, the macro level, the policy and the trends and what's going on with the movements that are trying to change how it works, what's industry have to say about it. But those 3 points are really important to me and help tell that story. And how it works for Orion, where I work, in Orion magazine, we have these, sometimes have had these one-page stories that we do. And I'll tell you a couple real quick that worked real great. One is over a decade ago, we had LaDonna Redmond talk about driving around Chicago, the west side of Chicago, talking about how this place is a food desert, how she needed Whole Foods for her son who was deathly allergic to everything. And she couldn't shop at this big new grocery store called Whole Foods because all of her friends said, well, that's whole paycheck, you know. So I'd never heard of food deserts before, and then I heard of whole paycheck, and then she talks about, you know, what her community had to say about it, what her husband and her talked about, and the way she brought it around was saying, we're going to start a local agriculture project here in the city, and we're going to create a greater diversity of food for us, and a greater diversity of people around the table as well. You know, not just diversity of food on the table, but around the table, people that we're going to break bread with. So, you know, just beautiful in one page. She said all that, and, you know, personal, community, and macro, brought it all back around. Michael Pollan, in 2003, he wrote a similar one-pager for us where he shared his misgivings about the national standards for organic that were coming down and saying, I see industry moving into this so fast, and I don't feel like it's going to change the food system like we hoped the organic movement was going to do. And what he ended up saying, his thesis was, it's time to get over organic, people. It's time to look at local. Local is the new organic movement. And it surprised a lot of people. I mean, it surprised me. I did apprenticeships at organic farms after college, and I said, what? But then I realized, oh yeah, but I was selling a lot of the organic produce at the farmer's market. And he's totally right. So he brought it all back around and beautifully. So for me, those are the sort of things that really work very well, and that's a good example of what we're trying to do at Orion is bring innovative new ideas around, but make them really personable and tell the story from where people can hear it. And the innovation part is a great thing too. We had a big feature about food hubs not too long ago, and I think for all of us here today or watching on a live stream, the download really is. We're all part of the food system. We're all eaters. There's an outlet for all of us. We can create our own outlets now. You know, we don't have to look too far. But there's incredible things like, you know, the edible publications that are in so many cities now that you can write for. There are blogs. There are video channels. That, you know, it depends on what you're interested in. But the opportunities now are really so great, and so. I would just tell everyone just to start telling stories.
That's great advice. So Diana Donlon, as I read the project that you're involved in, I think to myself, you might have the greatest challenge of all of us sitting here. I know that at the Center for Food Safety's Cool Foods campaign, one of the charges that you have been given is to do a lot of consumer education around soil. And I am imagining that at first blush, soil is not a compelling character. Tell us how you are going about this.
Sure. Well, thank you, Allison. So I'm going to tell you a quick story about an unsung hero, soil, and about hope and about solutions. So just approaching things from a climate point of view, we all know that our atmosphere is overwhelmed, and we should be at this magic number of 350 that we're not supposed to exceed, and we've exceeded it. We're at 400 parts per million of atmospheric CO2, and that's overwhelming our atmosphere's ability to absorb this CO2, and so that is dissolving into our oceans, and our poor oceans can't take the acidity, so they are, marine life is harmed in that process. But then there is a third large sink for our carbon, and that is the soil. And most people are actually quite surprised to learn that carbon in the soil is a good thing. And it's not only a good thing, it is a vital thing, and it has ancillary benefits. But we ignore our soil, so this poor unsung hero gives us this opportunity to solve, using Wendell Berry's words again, to solve for pattern. And by improving our soil health, which we know how to do, is low cost, has universal application, can be done anywhere at any scale. You can be a home gardener, or you could be rebuilding soil health on the side of a highway or in a village in West Africa. It has all these co-benefits. So for climate, absolutely, we have such an opportunity to rebuild the carbon that plants, through photosynthesis, they intake the CO2, and then they bring the carbon down into their roots, and some of it goes down. The further down the roots go, the further the carbon is going to go into the ground. And some of it is more stable. The further down the roots go, the more stable the carbon is. So there's the opportunity for climate. There's the opportunity, obviously, for health and nutrition, because we are only as healthy as our soils are. And I think Brian mentioned resilience. In order to have resilient food systems, we have to have healthy soil. But sometimes I think we forget that. We just take it for granted. And then, of course, another global problem is fresh water availability. And when you have healthy soil, the soil builds what are called aggregates. And the aggregates allow little pockets of air, and the water can percolate down into the soil, and the soil can become a big sponge for fresh water. In fact, increasing topsoil by just 1% in the top 6 inches, increasing the carbon content of topsoil by 1% will hold 27,000 gallons of fresh water on an acre. So that's a lot of water that healthy soil can hold. We've heard some people say that when we have this volatile weather now, we have this oscillation between drought and then we have floods. And one of the reasons we have floods is because the soil is in such poor health that it doesn't percolate down into the soil and recharge those aquifers the way it should. So there's just all these multiple problems that can be addressed by focusing on soil health. And 2015 has been designated as the Year of Soil by the United Nations. So we do have this wonderful global opportunity to focus on soil health and solve hunger problems, water problems, climate problems. And this is, the numbers vary, but Ratan Lal, who is a soil scientist at Ohio State University, his estimate is that our cultivated soils have lost 50 to 70% of their carbon content. So we have this enormous opportunity to rebuild them and sequester vast amounts of carbon. In fact, the same professor, Dr. Lal, estimates that of that 400 parts per million number that I mentioned, over the next century, we can sequester 75 to 100 parts per million of this atmospheric CO2. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't be doing other things, but this is a tool that we should be adding to our toolkit. So we should really celebrate soil as this unsung hero with a lot of hope and opportunity.
Thank you. Sarah, when I look at your bio, what strikes me is that you were sort of living in the world of sustainable agriculture through your studies, managing a farm market, and then you decide to move to an urban area, to the city of Baltimore, and sort of take on the work of food access, healthy food access, working under a food czar. It seems to me that the beginning of a conversation in Baltimore might be quite different than the beginning of a conversation you might have with other sustainable ag academics or working and living in a sort of farm market setting, that you're interacting on a day-to-day basis with a really different audience. Tell us how you get conversations about food started in your current work.
Sure. So ultimately, all the audiences are the same. They're all eaters. They're all people who care about food. So we can take the different things that each audience kind of cares about a little bit more than maybe some other aspects and weave those together into a story that matters to everybody. And so I'm not an author or a journalist, but I work mostly on policy issues, but we try to, through policy, make sure that we are considering our story as we're putting those policies together, and then also make sure that we're telling the story as we're pitching the policy to different people, and then as policies and programs are being rolled out, that they aren't just trying to get the most people participating or get the most acres under cultivation, that there is the story element and that there are these heroes into it. So I think one good example that we have that we just rolled out is a CSA for city employees in Baltimore. And we kind of have developed this strategy of doing research, partnering, and then kind of getting some buy-in from big higher ups to get our story out there to as many people as possible. So for the CSA, we knew we wanted to have a CSA where farmers would deliver directly to city employees. We decided to do lots of research, see who was working on programs like that. Looked at models all over the country on corporate CSAs, delivery services, anything that we could get some best practices and lessons learned from. And so we looked at the what and the how and the who, but especially the why. We wanted to know other people's stories and know why they were doing these programs to see if we were missing anything. So we had started out, we knew this would be a program under the mayor's Homegrown Baltimore umbrella about growing local and buying local and eating local. Then we saw a lot of other cities were also tying in this wellness element, which we also really liked. So those were our partners. We were able to take our heroes from just farmers and eaters to wellness, and that was everybody. Everybody could be a hero if they were eating better and feeling better and having better health outcomes. So then through those stories, we were able to approach more partners. We were able to partner with the labor commissioner for the city, who we never expected would be one of our biggest allies. We were able to get a labor union through the city to include CSAs as a reimbursable expense for their wellness incentive, which, like if you go to the gym and buy a gym membership, or if you get a new pair of glasses, they'll reimburse you up to a certain amount. Now CSAs are included under that. So through our research, we think that we are the first city, the first union to offer an incentive like that. So innovation like that is what can bring in bigger name partners like the mayor or big institutions who are going to help us tell our story. And so through press advisories, press conferences and media advisories, we were able to kind of get that model out into the world. We have other cities who have kind of approached us about our story. And now the mayor can take that as a model to the United States Conference of Mayors and tell her story to all of the other mayors and other cities and hope that they'll continue to tell our story as they develop similar models. So we think that everybody is the same audience. We just have to figure out how to get each person to buy in and what really matters to them.
Got it. One of the things about storytelling and food is that even in the space I work in, I write for a blog where we have probably people similar to the demographic in this room, people who are very engaged in food issues, know a lot about the issue already. But then we go to the news magazines, and the audience is much broader, and so the amount of base information that they have is a lot less. So you have to start the story one step back. You have to start the story at the beginning. And it's always interesting to me figuring out how to meet the audience where they are. You mentioned something just now, Sarah, that the what and the when of telling your story might have been the easier part. The why is, I feel like, the harder thing sometimes to convey. As I was listening to you talk, Vicki, you mentioned that when you were putting together this 10-mile diet, once people were engaged, they wanted to know the what and the when and the details. But at a certain point, you have to be able to tell people, well, why does it matter to be eating food grown 10 miles away? In that communicating those issues about, you mentioned reinvigorating the local economy. Did you find that you had to work a little harder to tell that part of the story?
What I did is what I realized I was doing was that food was no longer a product. Like, local food is not an alternative to grocery store food. Those are all products which don't put you in the story. That it's relational eating. The food places me in a place with people, in a landscape, and that's emotional. So I think what we're hearing too is that is that the call to action is not necessarily comes from the intellect. It comes from the emotions, that longing that we have to belong. And I say that eating is an act of belonging. Relational eating is an act of belonging. It's going from anywhere, anytime, anything eating in a sort of dead food system, like a vast food courts of the world. And everybody's had that experience. We sort of know it. To local relational eating in a real community, in a real place. So I think that it's emotional, and I think that's part of what you link into. And I think the other part you mentioned was moral. You know, so I'm not trying to tell people, I have a chapter in my book that goes, the 7 really good reasons and the 7 not so good reasons to eat local food. I really tried to parse that out, and I'm sure it's the chapter people skip because, you know. But I mean, I think this soul, I mean, this is real soul food. You know, that is real, I think the most radical thing I've done in my life is stay put. You know, someplace on earth. And I think people long for that. They long for that experience, that it's not, Social Security is not a policy. Social Security is being known by a real community of people and having made yourself useful to them and having made your mistakes in public and having been forgiven and forgive. And all of that is what eating, what local food is. It's that experience. So anyway, I think that's what I'm selling. I'm selling the heart and the soul.
Got it. Roger, you mentioned in your book, and I found this to be really interesting in your storytelling, is that what you found in Kenya was that some of what was missing there was some sort of basic information, right? That for years and years, the Kenyan farmers had been throwing a handful of seeds and thinking, well, some of them will take root, right? Some of them will germinate. They had to be taught very, very simple, given very, very simple instructions about 1 seed per hole or pull the weeds. Talk a little bit about the storytelling that was needed, not on your part, but on the part of the peer educators there to help educate, the storytelling that was used in educating. I'm remembering the scene from the book where the trainer had the farmers pretend that they were weeds and seeds.
Yeah, and that's another, it's kind of the stories within the story, so that we're telling a story about things, but in the characters, maybe they've got their own stories that they're telling. And that's a fascinating question then of how that then also becomes a driving force to the narrative of the greater story that you're trying to tell. But they would use a lot of role playing, kind of community drama, community action to have the farmers. And it's also then, you know, interesting when you're dealing with a community that may be largely illiterate. So handing out information, here's how you do things, is kind of meaningless. And so the spoken word becomes very important, but then just the showing of it and the acting out, that, you know, they brought 12 farmers to the stage, kind of in this time of agricultural extension, or extending the knowledge of these better farming techniques. And they had kind of a row of 6 in front and then 6 in the back, and the ones in front to kind of squat down. And they were the seeds, and then the ones in the back then were the weeds. And they said, okay, you in the back, put your hands on the shoulders of the women in front who are the seeds. So they did that, and they said, okay, seeds, try to stand up. And then the weeds said, oh, okay, I get it. And so they kind of tried to hold them down as much as possible. And that became really instructive for them. You got to weed properly because these weeds are holding you down as they are there. And so they would do that on a whole number of fronts. The whole repaying mechanism of microfinancing and why that's important, why you have to repay the credit. All of that done by that storytelling. That other point that you would ask about, and that we were talking about, the kind of why does it matter? Mm-hmm. And so kind of dealing with smallholder farmers in Africa, dealing with kind of the food thing. So you're kind of dealing with 3 things that, well, people may say, yeah, we don't care about any of that. But to basically be able to use these farmers and their stories and say, the more that these farmers succeed in conquering their hunger seasons, and here's how they're doing that, the more we all might succeed in this greater goal of securing our global food chain for the future. So that's why these farmers then that may have been neglected for all these years now become indispensable for us. So that's why you all need to be reading this story.
Got it. Erik, you mentioned currently you have an exhibit up in Massachusetts on heritage breeds of livestock. And I would imagine to a certain small sector of the world, this is fascinating in and of itself. But talk about how these photos start to tell a bigger story about diversity in livestock.
Yes, huge cultural storyline. I was sent to Poland to talk to farmers who were getting these heritage breeds of livestock back. It was a project of the Heifer Project International. You probably heard about them. Who, you can give a cow to someone, and when that cow has a calf, the calf goes to their neighbor, and then so on down the line. Very effective international, global, sustainable food relief agency, really, but it's a nonprofit here based in the U.S. But in Poland, instead of working with people who are on really basic survival terms in some ways, the project was to work with people who have farms and have a way of life, but it's been largely ruined by communist rule for a lot of years, and then market reforms that came in afterwards, who dictated, these are the kinds of animals you're allowed to raise, and this is what's going to work on our land, and this is how we're going to succeed as a society. And so they got rid of all these heritage breeds of animals that had been bred by monks and small landholders through the medieval period. And they were very well adapted to the soils and the harsh winters, and they could still make great milk or eggs, on the worst kind of forage. So Heifer staff went out and they found all these heritage breeds of animals on game farms and in people's personal collections and stuff. And they started breeding them in the country and then giving them out to farmers and saying, hey, you remember these chickens? Maybe your grandmother told you about them, right? And so it was this big cultural reunion of the farming community taking these animals back. And so I went there with my camera, mostly, and then I wrote a story around it to help tell the story. Just showing them back in relationship. And so I shot the whole thing in black and white on film and really nice and grainy, so it looked kind of antique in a way to say this is an old thing and now it's a new thing. And so yeah, I'm exhibiting them in the Berkshires this month and next month, and helping tell that story to people who might be interested in fine art. They might be interested in in a nice stroll down the street, and oh, here's a gallery, and walk in. But then you get this opportunity to tell a story through images that they connect to. So that was the point of the project.
Excellent. Sam, moving on to something quite different. You are on the receiving end of pitches all the time. And my experience being on the receiving end of pitches is that I oftentimes hear a lot of passion, but I can't quite yet see through to what I'm really being pitched, the sort of there. And I'm wondering, as you navigate this world with freelancers coming to you with story ideas, what are the common themes or the two tips that you can now give to people who are trying to frame stories that help them with effective storytelling?
Well, yeah, it's a great question, because often we get pitches that are topics. I would like to do a story about X, and then they'll give us all the reasons why X is important and why everybody should know about X, whether it's
sustainable
food
agriculture,
access, sustainable agriculture, food access in crisis regions of the world. Whatever it is. And my first response, and I would say about half the pitches come in that way. And my response is, what's the story? Like, how are you going to tell the story? And that weeds out probably 90% of the people.
They don't come back to you.
Well, because, yeah, they're not, I mean, storytelling is really, I think it is an art, it's a craft, and it's something that can be learned, but you really have to think about it, and you have to read great storytellers. And actually, Roger, I should mention, I read his book Enough, which is a great book about Africa, before I did a trip to Zambia to write about a food access in smallholder farmers. And it really sort of helped me frame the issue. So you're always looking for other writers and other storytellers who can help you sort of frame the issue in a way that it's like you're not telling the exact same story, but you can learn, you can learn the craft from reading other great storytellers. And so that's what I would say. But getting back to a point that you made, I think, which was really interesting, and this kind of ties in, is a lot of the issues that we're sort of talking about here are really issues of transparency. And I think one reason that we have a job is that, and that people crave what we're doing, is that for too long the discussion has really been monopolized by food marketing companies. And there wasn't, and food writers were people who did recipes, right? And you didn't have a department at NPR, you didn't have 3 food reporters who wrote about food issues, right? And of course, you know, there's always room for writing about, you know, great foods and recipes and chefs and what have you. But it's when you begin to make the connections to other issues and you begin to you know, tell stories that people don't know, whether it's the slave labor used in tomato farms or, you know, which was the case in Florida and now we hear in Mexico to some degree. You know, these are the stories that people crave because they don't know about them because those stories were controlled by the marketing department, right? And so that really gives us room, I think, too.
So I'm happy to take any questions from the audiences while you're getting brave enough to raise your hand. I'll keep Roger talking here for a minute. Something that you just said about when the pitches come to you, they're just sort of broad ideas and they have to be narrowed down. Roger is in the process of turning a book into a film, and I'm curious to know about that process where even a book is a whittled down version of a bigger idea. I'm imagining when you take something from book to film, you're concentrating and collapsing even more, I would imagine.
Yeah, because I think, yeah, you're narrowing the details of the scope. You can be more precise in what you're saying. And I think, I mean, as you're talking about the power of photos and what you're saying, or just of views, I think is remarkable. And something that I mean, for 30 years I was at the Wall Street Journal, and most of that time we didn't even run photos. So I'm not even, would rarely think about stories in a visual sense, but I'm learning to now and really understanding kind of the driving nature of that, and it's a really great accompaniment. Infographics, things that are really, you know, lively, and so like this next book that I'm working on, 1,000 days of from a woman's pregnancy to the second birthday of the child. There's tremendous infographics out there that really explain things, and I think also then with the films and the short films that we're also developing, it makes you then think of the compelling nature, and the great thing is that then you can actually hear the farmers themselves speak, and you see the scenery, and I think that is a great addition and accompaniment to the written word.
Sure,
that
once it's hitting in on all the more senses.
Exactly.
And
you hear the cadence of the talk and the language that they use and things, and it just enriches the storytelling so much.
So maybe you're saying a little bit less, but saying it with more heart. So we've got some questions from the audience, not from the audience, but people who are watching online. Kira from Berkeley is wondering, what platforms and media do you find most exciting or effective for telling multifaceted, complex stories about food? So I am happy to throw that to, you know, as a reader, Sarah, you can weigh in. As an editor, Sam, you can weigh in. Anyone who, Diana, you can weigh in from your perspective. Erik, anybody want to go at it?
I would say any and all mediums. And essentially what we try and do in our stories is, like we say, if we sell it once, which is to sell it to a publication, that's great, but I want to sell a story like 3 or 4 times over, which means that, you know, it appears in print, it appears online, it's tweeted, people are starting a Facebook discussion about it. There's a slideshow that goes along with it that gets shared. You know, it's like any and all ways that can sort of, you know, drive discussion about that issue, and all of those different mediums kind of, you know, interact with each other in ways I think that we don't fully understand, but it's quite powerful.
Sure.
So don't think singular. You got to always be thinking of multi-platforms,
including the infographics you just mentioned, Roger.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also kind of the interaction that you have with people kind of in the other mediums can also help. And so some of the times that I was in Western Kenya, a lot of the times decoders, the filmmakers, learn so much of them because they're seeing things and honing in on things that are then maybe much different than what I'm concentrating on, what somebody is saying. So it's a fascinating project on the multimedia.
Got it. Yeah, Vicki.
I want to, you mentioned Twitter, and I just want to, Facebook, Twitter, I think the combination of a soundbite, and we sort of look down on sound bites, but I think a soundbite is a story that can unfurl, that somebody carries with it, unfurls in their own mind. Like when I was doing money, we talked about the gazingas pin, the thing you buy and you don't need, and you put it in the gazingas pin drawer. And everybody remembers that. You know, and then on Facebook, people are taking a picture, you know, and putting just these little quotes on it, and those travel. I mean, millions of people will look at that picture and that pithy statement. So there's you know, big long stories, and then there's these very brief stories of sound bites.
Got it. Diana, quickly, we have 2 minutes and one more question.
Sure. One of the ways we get our story out is by doing short videos and interviewing farmers about how they rebuild their soil carbon and just the, you know, the passion with which they address the subject, and the results that they get helps tell this story.
Got it. And Danny mentioned Twitter right before we came on stage. Apparently this conference is #2 trending. So imagine the conversations that are being sparked out there. This is from Sylvia Burgos. What do writers need to help develop more compelling stories that change people's minds and hearts and move them to action? Sam?
I was going to say Roger.
Roger?
No, it's, yeah, it takes a lot of work to find the right story that sort of makes the point you want to make. And it's really tough, I think, for writers who are starting out because, you know, 90% of your interviews get left on the cutting room floor, and you've got to be willing to do that. And then you find the one interview or the one character that really helps the story, and maybe you can bring in back in some of that other stuff. But you know, it's just a lot of work. it's not
for the faint of heart.
Yeah.
I'd say, I mean, you need curiosity.
Yeah,
that kind of drives your questioning and to go off and do the story. Then also kind of a caring. I mean, this whole thing that journalists are supposed to be kind of some kind of out-of-body thing, that you're just kind of an objective thing in interviewing people. And doing that, I think, is, for certain news stories, you have to do that. But there's also an investment of yourself and emotions and caring. And kind of this outrage. I mean, I get outraged easily over things that I say. So I guess that helps. But it can be empathy on the other hand, or kind of the inspirational.
And you're free to do that now that you're not a Wall Street Journal reporter.
Yeah, exactly. I would have people say, do your editors know what you're saying or what you're writing? I said, I would hope so, but perhaps not.
Thank you so much. We're out of time. So here's to curiosity and compelling characters. Thanks to all of you.
Allison, I'm going to break protocol a little bit. I think if we want to take a question from the audience and cut our break a little bit shorter, that would be great.
Oh, great. Okay.
But it's up to you.
All right. Yeah, sure. Right over here. With the long hair. Oh, yeah. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Miriam. I'm a food writer from Switzerland, which is, we have a lot of agriculture at home, so this is very much linked to our identity. I'm a food writer. I had the luck to work for radio and TV and all that. So basically, I can do all of it, and I agree with you that we should do all of it. However, I have one problem. Whatever I do gets me a lot of street cred, but my editor or my publisher thinks it's neat if I offer a story about a farmer or a cheesemaker that can even tell what the cow ate when he tastes the milk. But he's not really willing to pay for expenses. He's not really willing to pay for the text. I'm happy to write it, but how do I live? So my question is, how do I convince publishers that this is actually a topic that is, I think, as important as politics? Because they get, you know, they're happy to pay the expenses for them, you know.
Interesting question. I guess you could write a book and get an advance.
Well, the thing is, you know, the territory is narrower and narrower. When I wrote Your Money, Your Life in 1990, there were a lot more authors who were getting entry in through the publishers because there were many more publishing companies. Now the concentration of publishing companies is like they either buy Stephen King or somebody who's already had a best-selling book and they'll take a chance on them. So when you asked, like, what does it take to write compelling stories, I was going to say a day job and money, you know. In a way, in the world as it is, we do need to be creative about bringing in an income that doesn't necessarily come from the story we write. And that's tough, but I think it's a reality. That's why the passion is so important, you know, that you can't not do it. That's not the answer you wanted.
Yeah, reality check, right?
Yeah, freelancing is really hard. It's hard to get paid. But initiatives like Fern I find really exciting. Because, I mean, Fern is built on the same model like ProPublica and other ones are built on, that, you know, they're trying to incubate and find the best storytellers out there. And if you can, you know, find those medium players in the middle, you know, you'll have a better shot at bringing things forward. But I guess my main thing for a long time was just writing a lot of bad stuff. I just wasn't very good, but I just kept writing, you know.
Practice makes
kept
perfect.
Writing, and now I've gotten somewhat better. And I all the credit to good editors. I think good editors are very underappreciated, but you got to work in partnership with these folks, and they make you a better writer if you keep at it.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, editors are always under constraints, and so it's best to know what their constraints are and who may have less constraints in the areas, you know, that you're interested in. But I mean, your issue is precisely why our organization exists, because we work with reporters and we fund them and we bring those stories to outlets. So it takes away some of the economic pressures, you know, from the organization, from the publisher.
Did we want to do one more, Danny? Okay, sure. One more question out there. Okay, in the red sweater. Yep.
Hi, I'm Louis Wirtz with Eco Agriculture Partners, and Thomas was on the morning panel, and he mentioned that food is a silo buster. And I wondered, and sometimes that makes it really complicated to tell a food story, because it's a water story, and it's an environment story, and it's a social story or an economic story. And so I wondered if you could talk about how, maybe from the side of being pitched, where, like, how you, or what you work with on reporters or as a writer yourself, how you choose which of those things you're going to hang the story on, or if you have to, or how you tell an integrated story. How does that work?
Sure. Well, personally, I mean, things I heard today are things I deal with all the time. I think Erik mentioned the formula of personal, community, macro, right? Starting with the story. You know, Frank was mentioning in the introduction, it's compelling characters. So you're almost always starting with a person's story, right? Is that what you find when you get down to a lot of what you're producing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a danger of looking at a story just as a silo, because you really, if you just look at it as a water story, you know, drought in California, that's one thing. Well, how is drought affecting farm worker migration and, you know, pressures that farm workers are under, you know, who are already under pressure anyway economically? Then your water story becomes a social story, you know, and so I really believe anytime you can overlap as many of those issues as you can without losing the focus of the narrative, it'll make a stronger story.
Got it.
I want to add something. So working at the intersection of food and climate, the climate movement has been very technology and emissions focused, and food, bringing that silo buster to the climate community is really a challenge. Because they think of food as soft and sort of, even in California's landmark AB 32, which passed in 2006, I believe, agriculture was listed as an other in terms of emissions and in terms of, you know, strategies, and that's being amended now. But so that's a challenge, an ongoing challenge to be aware of the silos that all these different movements exist in. And I do think that because food, since we're all eaters, to paraphrase what you said, that has the greatest potential for for breaking these silos. But I think partially we all have to become better listeners because we think we often know the answers to the story before it's even been told.
One more. Back here with the white scarf.
Hi, Liz Hallinan with Compassion Over Killing. Heifer International aside, given that we raise 9 billion animals every year to eat, why are animals so rarely the focus of the story about food?
Who wants to take that on?
Why are they
Why are they rarely the focus of the story and food?
Oh my God! When I look at it, animals are everywhere.
Yeah.
The battle. Excuse me. The battle for mind share around should you eat meat or not eat meat. That battle is raging, and so I think that makes how animals are raised. I just heard that some major corporation has just been pressured by their food service company to have grass-fed beef in their chain because that is getting to be known. I don't know if it's like the emotional story of raising animals, but it is definitely eating meat is a charged issue, and you get in through that charged issue, and you can say a lot about how animals are raised and how they're treated and how they're slaughtered and life and death and that we all die and it's a cycle of life. You can get in there through meat.
And climate change.
Yeah, right. It's the theme of a lot of the work that we've done. It comes up, I'd say, almost daily in my organization. So,
yeah, I agree.
There was a front page story in the New York Times yesterday that it was a front page top left, and then the jump was 2 full pages about this, you guys read it, I'm sure, about the inhumane treatment of animals at this research facility that was really quite illuminating and distressing. So,
yeah. Okay, one more question. Okay, over here, if the microphone can get there.
Thank you. My name is Jason Poole from University of Maryland, Sustainable Agriculture student. This is specifically for Vicki, and I loved your whole ethos and sort of eating in a specific way where you're connected to your community. And I wonder if there's a logical jump in that to other products that you buy. Obviously you're not going to find locally made sneakers, perhaps, but I wonder if you can carry that sort of ethos on, and perhaps you have a resource or something that tells you what other companies for different products that you use in your daily life sort of like ties into the way that you live conscientiously. I mean, is there a website or something that you go, oh, well, I'm going to go use this company for my garments in making those decisions? Thank you.
I don't really have a website. What I'd say is that from my own experience, I discovered that the food system isn't out there. It's sort of arrays around me. And I can be most moral in relationships where I can see, smell, taste, touch, and within like a neighborhood. So rolling out from what you can actually experience, the kind of relations you can experience, you have to use the the systems of evaluation, fair trade, slave-free. There's a lot of evaluative marks and checklists, et cetera, that you use. The Environmental Working Group can offer you some things, some checklists. That's what I think is you have to find the organization or the speaker that you can trust who's actually gone out there and found out at a distance from you that you can't see, taste, or touch. If anybody else has anything.
I just want to thank Allison and Frank and all of our panelists. This has been a very awesome panel, and I'm really glad we got to hear all these stories.